The chainsaw roared to life as David Miller stared at the pristine blue water that had cost him $30,000. Karen's voice echoed from across the fence. You can't just destroy their happiness. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this pool held a secret that would shatter 3 families forever. As the first concrete chunk crashed into the water, David smiled grimly. Sometimes the only way to save your children is to destroy everything they love. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Miller family's backyard as David stared at the sparkling pool that had become his prison. 3 years of payments. 3 years of Karen Walsh's entitled children treating his property like their personal water park. 3 years of watching his own kids, Emma, 12, and Tyler, 9, become strangers in their own home. Dad. Emma's voice drifted from the kitchen window. The Walsh kids are here again. David's jaw clenched as he watched Karen's twins, Brandon and Brittany, both 11, vault over the 4-foot fence that separated their properties. They moved with the casual arrogance of children who'd never been told no, their designer swimsuits already wet from their morning swim in what should have been his family's private sanctuary. Tell them we are not opening the pool today, David called back, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd fought this battle too many times. They're not listening, Emma replied, her tone flat with resignation. Of course they weren't. They never did. David pulled on his work boots and headed for the backyard, his footsteps heavy on the deck planks. The Walsh twins had already claimed the pool floats, the expensive ones David had bought for Emma's birthday last month. Brandon was doing cannonballs off the diving board while Brittany shrieked with delight, her voice piercing the morning quiet. Hey! David shouted, his patience finally snapping. Get out of my pool. Brandon surfaced, water streaming from his blonde hair, a smirk playing on his lips. Karen said we could swim whenever we want. She said you're being mean to kids. This is my property, David said, his voice low and dangerous. Get out. Now. Make me, Brandon shot back, diving underwater and swimming toward the deep end. The sliding door behind David opened with a sharp crack. They're a problem here. David turned to see Karen Walsh standing on his deck like she owned it, her perfectly manicured hands on her hips. At 42, she maintained the aggressive confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. Her blonde hair was pulled into a messy bun that probably took 30 minutes to achieve, and her yoga outfit cost more than David's monthly mortgage payment. Yes, there's a problem, David said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. Your kids are trespassing. Karen laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Trespassing? They're children, David. They just want to swim. In my pool. On my property. Without permission. Oh, please. Karen waved dismissively. It's just water. You're not even using it. That was the problem. David wasn't using it because Karen's kids had claimed it as their own. Every morning at 7:30, they'd appear like locusts, bringing their friends, leaving trash, breaking pool equipment. When David had installed a lock on the gate, Karen had called the HOA, claiming he was creating a hostile environment for children. When he'd spoken to her husband Richard, a weak-chinned man who worked 80-hour weeks to avoid coming home, Richard had just shrugged and said, "Kids will be kids." Where are your parents? David asked the twins. Dad's at work, Brittany said, floating on her back. Mom's getting her nails done. David looked at Karen. So you just left them here? They're fine, Karen said. Besides, your wife loves having them around. That was a lie, and they both knew it. Sarah had been battling severe depression since her father's death 6 months ago. The constant invasion of their private space. The noise, the chaos, it was destroying what little peace she had left. She'd started spending entire days locked in their bedroom, emerging only when the Walsh invasion finally ended each evening. My wife is not a babysitter, David said. She doesn't mind, Karen insisted. And honestly, David, it's good for your kids to have friends over. My kids can't use their own pool because yours won't share. Karen's expression hardened. That's not my problem. Maybe if Emma and Tyler were more assertive, don't. David's voice cut through the air like a blade. Don't you dare blame my children for your failures as a parent. Excuse me. Karen stepped closer, her voice rising. I am an excellent mother. My children are confident and strong-willed. They don't cower in corners like some kids I could mention. The insult hit its mark. Emma had always been quiet, preferring books to crowds. Tyler struggled with anxiety, especially in social situations. David had worked for years to help his son build confidence, only to watch Karen's aggressive children tear it down day after day. "Get your kids out of my pool," David said, his voice deadly quiet. "Or what?" Karen crossed her arms. "You'll call the police on children." "If I have to." Karen's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Go ahead. Call them. Tell them you're harassing kids for swimming. See how that plays with your neighbors." She was right, and they both knew it. In their suburban subdivision, image was everything. David was already viewed as the difficult neighbor because he'd complained about noise ordinances and property line violations. Karen, meanwhile, was the PTA president, the neighborhood social coordinator, the woman who organized block parties and charity drives. She'd position herself as the community's beloved mother figure while systematically destroying David's family's peace. "This ends today," David said. "Really?" Karen's eyebrows arched. "And how exactly do you plan to make that happen?" David didn't answer. He pulled out his phone and dialed. "Miller Pool Services." The voice on the other end answered. "This is David Miller on Elm Street," he said, never taking his eyes off Karen. "I need you to come out today. I want to remove my pool." Karen's smirk faltered. "You can't be serious." "Completely serious," David told the contractor. "How soon can you start?" "We could have a crew there this afternoon for the initial assessment," the voice replied. "Full removal would take about a week." "Perfect. Send them over." David hung up and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Karen stared at him, her mouth slightly open. "You're bluffing," she said. "Am I?" "You can't just destroy a pool. Think about your property value. Think about your children." "I am thinking about my children," David said. "I'm thinking about how they deserve to feel safe and welcome in their own home." "Brandon, Brittany, get out of the pool." Karen shouted suddenly. For the first time in 3 years, her children actually listened. They climbed out reluctantly, water dripping onto the deck. "You're insane," Karen said, her voice shaking with rage. "You'd rather destroy something beautiful than share it with children. What kind of person are you?" "The kind who's tired of being walked on." Karen gathered her children and stormed toward the fence. At the property line, she turned back. "This isn't over, David. You want to play hardball? Fine. But you have no idea what you've just started." As she disappeared into her house, David heard the sliding door open behind him. Sarah emerged, wrapped in her bathrobe, her dark hair unwashed and tangled. "Did you really call the pool company?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." "David." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "The kids will be heartbroken." "The kids haven't been able to use the pool in months," David replied gently. "This isn't about taking something away from them. It's about taking our lives back." Sarah nodded slowly, but David could see the doubt in her eyes. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "I need to lie down," she said, and disappeared back into the house. David stood alone in his backyard, staring at the pool that had become a symbol of everything wrong with his life. The water was still and perfect, reflecting the morning sky like a mirror. In 6 hours, the contractors would arrive. In a week, it would be gone. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." David smiled grimly and deleted the message. Karen Walsh had no idea what she was dealing with, but she was about to find out. What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that David had spent 15 years as a private investigator before switching to insurance adjustment. He knew how to dig. He knew how to find secrets. And over the past 3 years of dealing with the Walsh family's entitled behavior, he'd been digging very, very deep. The pool removal was just the beginning. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the Miller Pool Services truck sat in David's driveway like a declaration of war. The crew chief, a weathered man named Martinez, walked the perimeter of the pool with David, measuring and taking notes. "Beautiful pool," Martinez said, shaking his head. "Shame to see it go." Mind me asking why? Neighbor problems, David said simply. Martinez nodded knowingly. Ah. Say no more. I've seen it before. Sometimes the only way to solve a problem is to eliminate it completely. As they spoke, David noticed curtains twitching in windows up and down Elm Street. Word traveled fast in Willowbrook Estates. Karen had undoubtedly been working the phones all afternoon, spinning her version of events to anyone who would listen. How long will it take? David asked. Full removal? About 5 days. We'll drain it first, then break up the concrete with jackhammers. It's going to be loud and messy. Perfect. Martinez raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He'd learned not to question clients' motivations too closely. As the crew finished their assessment, Emma and Tyler returned from school. David watched from the kitchen window as they spotted the truck, their faces falling. Emma dropped her backpack and ran toward the pool. Dad! She burst through the sliding door, tears already streaming down her face. What's happening? Why are there trucks here? Tyler appeared behind her, his face pale with confusion. Are they fixing the pool? David knelt down to their level, his heart breaking at their expressions. No, buddy. They're going to remove it. Remove it. Tyler's voice cracked. But it's our pool. No, honey, David said gently. It hasn't been our pool for a long time. Emma's tears came harder. But I was going to have my birthday party here next month. You promised. We'll find somewhere else for your party, David said. Somewhere better. Somewhere that's actually ours. I don't understand, Tyler whispered. Did we do something wrong? Before David could answer, the back gate burst open. Karen Walsh strode in like an avenging angel, her face flushed with righteous fury. Behind her trailed what looked like half the neighborhood, Mrs. Peterson from 2 houses down, the Johnsons from across the street, and several other parents David recognized from school events. David Miller. Karen's voice rang across the yard. What the hell do you think you're doing? David rose slowly, placing himself between Karen and his children. I'm removing my pool from my property. Last I checked, that was my right. Not when it affects the entire community. Mrs. Peterson chimed in. She was a thin woman in her 60s who treated the HOA like her personal kingdom. That pool has been the centerpiece of our children's summer activities for years. My pool. David emphasized. My property taxes. My maintenance costs. My insurance liability. This is about more than property rights, Karen said, her voice rising to its trademark shriek. This is about children's happiness. This is about community. More neighbors had gathered at the fence, drawn by the commotion. David recognized most of them, people who'd smiled and waved at block parties while secretly resenting his family's good fortune in having the only pool in the subdivision. Where were you all when Karen's kids were destroying my property? David asked the crowd. Where was this community spirit when my family couldn't use our own backyard? Oh, please, Karen scoffed. A few broken toys and you're acting like it's the end of the world. A few broken toys. David's voice turned. Dangerous. How about the diving board they cracked doing flips? The pool liner they tore with pool toys I specifically asked them not to bring? The gate lock they broke trying to climb over it? Kids will be kids, Mrs. Peterson said dismissively. You can't expect perfection. I expected basic respect. David replied. I expected parents to supervise their children. I expected people to ask permission before using my property. Karen stepped closer, her face twisted with anger. You're destroying something beautiful out of spite. You're punishing innocent children because you're too selfish to share. I'm protecting my family, David said quietly. Your family. Karen laughed harshly. Look at them, David. Look at what you're doing to your own children. David turned to see Emma and Tyler huddled together by the sliding door, both crying. The sight hit him like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain. Steady. Emma, Tyler, he called gently. Come here. They approached reluctantly, their faces streaked with tears. I know this is hard, David said, kneeling again. But sometimes we have to make difficult choices to protect the people we love. But I loved the pool, Tyler whispered. I know you did, buddy. But tell me, When was the last time you actually got to swim in it? Tyler thought for a moment, his brow furrowing. I don't remember. It was Memorial Day weekend, Emma said, quietly. 3 months ago, before Brandon started bringing his whole soccer team over. Karen's face flushed. That's not. It's true, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger. Every time we wanted to swim, Brandon and Brittany were already there. And when we asked if we could play too, Brandon said it was too crowded. In my own pool, Tyler added, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. The crowd of neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Several of them looked away, sudden guilt flickering across their faces. Well, Mrs. Peterson said weakly, surely we can. Work something out. Some kind of schedule. I tried schedules, David said, standing. I tried locks. I tried talking. I tried going through the HOA. Nothing worked. This is the only solution left. Karen's eyes blazed with fury. Fine. You want to be petty? Two can play that game. She turned to the crowd. I want everyone to see this. I want everyone to remember that David Miller destroyed something beautiful rather than share it with children. I want everyone to remember what kind of man puts property over happiness. She spun back to David, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him. You think removing the pool ends this? You have no idea what I'm capable of. By the time I'm done with you, your family won't be welcome anywhere in this town. Is that a threat? David asked calmly. It's a promise, Karen hissed. As she stalked away, dragging the crowd of neighbors with her, David heard her voice carrying on the evening air. Emergency HOA meeting tomorrow night. 7 o'clock. We need to discuss what to do about neighbors who destroy community assets. Emma tugged on David's sleeve. Dad, are we in trouble? David looked down at his daughter's worried face, then at his son's tear-stained cheeks. Behind them, through the sliding door, he could see Sarah watching from the shadows of the kitchen, her face unreadable. No, sweetheart, he said finally. We are not in trouble. But things are going to get complicated for a while. As the neighbors dispersed and the pool crew packed up their equipment, David's phone buzzed with a text from his old partner at the private investigation firm. Heard through the grapevine you might need some help. The Walsh file is ready when you are. David deleted the message and looked at the pool one last time. The water was still perfect, still blue, still reflecting the sky like it hadn't heard a word of the war being declared around it. By this time tomorrow, Karen Walsh would have mobilized the entire HOA against him. By the end of the week, his family would be social pariahs in their own neighborhood. But David had been preparing for this moment for 3 years. And what Karen Walsh didn't know was that her perfect suburban facade was built on foundations of sand. The pool removal was just the opening move. The real game was about to begin. The Willowbrook Estates Community Center had never seen a crowd like this. By 6:45, every folding chair was occupied, with dozens more residents standing along the walls. The air crackled with anticipation and barely contained hostility. David sat in the back row, flanked by empty chairs. No one wanted to be seen supporting him. Karen Walsh commanded the front of the room like a general addressing her troops. She dressed for war in a crisp white blazer and pearls, her blonde hair swept into a power bun that added 2 inches to her height. The HOA board flanked her like loyal lieutenants, Mrs. Peterson, Mr. Hendricks the treasurer, and Janet Collins, the secretary who documented every neighborhood transgression with religious fervor. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. Karen began, her voice carrying easily through the packed room. We are here tonight because one of our neighbors has declared war on our community's values. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. David recognized most of the faces, parents from school events, neighbors he'd exchanged pleasantries with for years. Now they stared at him with open hostility. For 3 years, Karen continued, her voice rising with practiced indignation. My children and many others have enjoyed swimming in the Miller Pool. It became a gathering place, a source of joy for our kids during long summer days. And now, out of pure spite, David Miller has decided to destroy that happiness. It's my pool, David said quietly, but his voice carried in the silent room. Karen whirled to face him, her eyes blazing. Is it really? When you bought this house, you knew you were joining a community. You knew that having the only pool in the subdivision came with certain social responsibilities. Social responsibilities. David stood slowly. Like letting your kids vandalize my property? Like turning my backyard into an unsupervised daycare center? They were swimming, not vandalizing, Mrs. Peterson interjected. Children need places to play. Then why didn't you install a pool? David asked pointedly. The question hung in the air like smoke. Several neighbors shifted uncomfortably. The truth was obvious but unspoken. They all wanted access to a pool, but none wanted the expense and liability of owning one. Karen recovered quickly. This isn't about money, David. This is about community spirit. This is about putting children's well-being above petty property concerns. Petty. David's voice hardened. $28,000 in installation costs. $4,000 in annual maintenance. $1,600 in insurance increases. Is that petty to you, Karen? You can afford it, someone called from the crowd. David turned toward the voice. It was Jim Martinez from 3 streets over, a man who drove a BMW but claimed poverty every time the HOA suggested assessment increases. Can I? David asked. How do you know what I can afford? Well, you have that nice car, Jim said weakly. A 3-year-old Honda Civic. David almost laughed. Karen drives a Range Rover. Why don't you ask her to install a pool? This isn't about cars, Karen snapped, regaining control. This is about your selfish decision to destroy something beautiful, something that brought joy to children. The crowd murmured approval. Karen had played her hand perfectly, positioning herself as the defender of children while painting David as a heartless destroyer of dreams. Janet, Karen continued, turning to the secretary, please read the relevant HOA covenants regarding community impacting property modifications. Janet Collins stood, her reading glasses perched on her nose like a weapon. Section 4.7 states that any modification to property that significantly impacts neighborhood aesthetics or community enjoyment must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. David felt the trap closing around him. I'm removing something from my property, not adding to it. The removal of a major landscape feature absolutely qualifies, Mrs. Peterson said smugly. You should have applied for approval before calling the contractors. And how would that vote have gone? David asked. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Everyone knew the answer. Karen stepped forward, sensing victory. I move that we issue an immediate cease and desist order regarding the pool removal, pending a proper review process. Seconded, Mrs. Peterson said quickly. All in favor? Hands shot up throughout the room. David counted quickly, at least 40 votes in favor. Motion passes, Karen announced triumphantly. David, you'll need to cancel your contractors immediately. David remained seated, his expression calm. Actually, I won't. The room erupted in surprised chatter. Karen's perfect composure cracked slightly. I'm sorry, she said. I said I won't be canceling anything. David stood again, pulling a thick manila folder from beneath his chair. You see, while you were busy playing community leader, I did some research into HOA enforcement powers. He opened the folder, revealing dozens of legal documents. According to Texas Property Code Section 209.009, an HOA cannot retroactively enforce architectural restrictions on property modifications that were legally permitted at the time of installation. The pool was installed before the current restrictions were enacted, David continued, which means it's grandfathered in. And if it's grandfathered in, I have the absolute right to remove it without HOA approval. Mrs. Peterson's face flushed red. That's a technicality. It's the law, David replied calmly. But that's not the only interesting thing I discovered while researching our neighborhood's legal standing. He pulled out another set of documents. The room fell silent, sensing a shift in the battle's momentum. For instance, David said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, I found it fascinating that our HOA president has been using community funds for personal expenses. $1,700 in community relations dinners at restaurants. That just happened to be her favorites. $2,300 in administrative supplies from an office store owned by her brother-in-law. Karen's face went white. Those are legitimate community expenses, are they? David pulled out a receipt. Like this $800 community planning dinner at La Bernardine in Manhattan? When exactly did our HOA start operating in New York, Karen? The crowd stirred uneasily. Several parents exchanged worried glances. Or this one, David continued relentlessly. $1,500 for landscape consultation from Walsh Design Services. That wouldn't happen to be your husband's company. Would it, Karen? Richard does excellent work, Karen said weakly. I'm sure he does. But charging the HOA full commercial rates for work on your own property seems like a conflict of interest, doesn't it? Mrs. Peterson jumped to her feet. This is outrageous. You can't just make accusations. I'm not making accusations, David said, pulling out more documents. I'm presenting evidence. 3 years' worth of financial records that I obtained through a perfectly legal information request. Every receipt, every invoice, every suspicious transaction. He looked directly at Karen, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. Did you really think no one would notice, Karen? Did you think you could steal from your neighbors while lecturing them about community values? Karen's perfect composure finally shattered. I haven't stolen anything. Those were legitimate expenses. Then you won't mind explaining them to the district attorney, David said. I've already scheduled a meeting for Monday morning. The room exploded in chaos. Neighbors turned to each other, voices rising in confusion and anger. Some shouted questions at Karen, others demanded explanations from the board. Mrs. Peterson banged her gavel futilely, trying to restore order through it all. Karen stared at David with pure hatred, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. In real time. You bastard, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the noise. You calculated, vindictive bastard. David smiled coldly. I learned from the best. As the meeting devolved into chaos, David gathered his papers and headed for the exit. At the door, he turned back one final time. Oh, and Karen, he called out, his voice cutting through the noise. The pool removal starts at 8 a.m. sharp. You might want to keep your kids inside. It's going to be loud. As David walked to his car, he could hear Karen's voice rising above the crowd, desperate and shrill, trying to regain control of a narrative that had just slipped through her fingers. Like water, but David knew the truth. Karen Walsh had built her power on lies and stolen money. And now that the foundation was cracking, her perfect suburban empire was about to come crashing down. What she didn't know was that the HOA embezzlement was just the beginning. David had been digging for 3 years, and Karen's secrets went much deeper than missing community funds.by morning. Everyone in Willowbrook Estates would know exactly who Karen Walsh really was. And by the end of the week, she'd be Luke. The sound of jackhammers filled the morning air at precisely 8 a.m., drowning out the protests from across the fence. David stood on his deck with a cup of coffee, watching Martinez's crew systematically destroy the pool that had caused 3 years of torment. Each crack of concrete felt like vindication. His phone had been ringing non-stop since dawn. Neighbors who'd shunned him at the meeting were now calling with stammered apologies and requests for more information about Karen's financial improprieties. David let them all go to voicemail. He had bigger concerns this morning. Sarah emerged from the house, still in her bathrobe but looking more alert than she had in months. The kids want to know if they can watch, she said, gesturing toward Emma and Tyler, who were pressed against the kitchen window. Of course, David said. They should see this. As Emma and Tyler joined them on the deck, David noticed Karen's house was conspicuously quiet. No sign of the twins, no morning routine on the back patio. The Range Rover was gone from the driveway. Dad, Emma said softly, are we really not in trouble? David put his arm around his daughter. No, sweetheart. We are not in trouble. But everyone was so angry last night, Tyler added, his anxiety evident. They were angry because they believed lies, David explained. But the truth has a way of coming out. As if summoned by his words, a white sedan pulled into the Walsh driveway. 2 men in suits emerged, one carrying a briefcase, the other a camera. David's ex-partner, Marcus Rivera, climbed out of the driver's seat and gave David a subtle wave. Who are those men? Sarah asked. The district attorney's investigators, David said calmly. Right on schedule. The implications hit Sarah immediately. David, what exactly did you find? Before he could answer, his phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. It's worse than we thought. Check your email. David excused himself and went inside to his computer. The email contained a single PDF attachment, labeled Walsh Investigation, Final Report. David's hands were steady as he opened it, but what he saw made his blood run cold. The embezzlement was nothing compared to the rest. Karen Walsh wasn't just stealing from the HOA. She was running an elaborate mortgage fraud scheme, using her position as a real estate agent to manipulate appraisals and loan documents. She'd been selling the same properties multiple times to shell companies, pocketing the difference. The scope was staggering, over $2 million in fraudulent transactions across 3 counties. But it got worse. The report detailed how Karen had been systematically targeting elderly homeowners, convincing them to take out reverse mortgages and equity loans they didn't understand, then funneling the money through her husband's fake landscaping company. At least 12 seniors had lost their homes, including Mrs. Chen from Maple Street, who'd been forced into a nursing home when she could no longer afford her mortgage payments. David's phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen. Jesus Christ. Marcus, David said without preamble. How deep does this go? Deeper than we imagined, Marcus replied. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit has been tracking similar schemes across Texas. Your Karen Walsh is a small fish in a very big pond. Small fish. David looked out at the investigators photographing the Walsh house. She's destroyed lives. Which is why they want her to flip on the bigger players. But David. Marcus's voice turned serious. She knows you're the one who brought this down. And cornered animals do desperate things. As if on cue, David heard tires screeching in the front driveway. Through the living room window, he saw Karen's Range Rover sliding to a stop at an angle that suggested panic rather than parking. She burst from the driver's seat like a woman possessed, her perfect hair disheveled, her makeup smeared. David! She screamed, pounding on his front door. David Miller, you come out here right now. Sarah appeared at David's side, her face pale. Should we call the police? They're already here, David said, gesturing toward the investigators who were now walking across the street toward his house. The pounding intensified. I know you can hear me, you bastard. You think you've won? You think destroying me will fix your pathetic life? David opened the door slowly. Karen stood on his porch like a fury from Greek mythology, her designer clothes wrinkled, her eyes wild with desperation and rage. Hello, Karen, David said calmly. You did this, she hissed. 3 years of digging through my life like some kind of stalker. What kind of sick person are you? The kind who protects his family, David replied. Your family. Karen laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Look around, David. Look at what you've done to your own children. They're crying inside because their father is a vindictive psychopath who destroys pools out of spite. Actually, Emma's voice came from behind David. We are not crying. David turned to see his daughter standing in the doorway, Tyler beside her. Both children looked calmer than they had in months. We are relieved, Emma continued, looking directly at Karen. For the first time in years, our backyard is actually ours. Karen's face contorted with rage. You've poisoned them against me. Turned children against. One of the investigators had approached the porch. I'm Agent Rodriguez with the DA's office. We need to speak with you. Karen whirled around, her desperation evident. This is harassment. I haven't done anything wrong. We have evidence suggesting otherwise, Rodriguez said calmly. We'd prefer to discuss this civilly, but if necessary, evidence. Karen's voice cracked. What evidence? David Miller's lies? He's obsessed with my family. He's been stalking us for years. David stepped forward, pulling out his phone. Would you like to hear the recording of you bribing City Inspector Harold Morrison to overlook code violations at the Westfield development? Karen's face went white. Or maybe the one where you discussed inflating appraisals with mortgage broker Stephen Hayes. David continued. I have 47 hours of recordings, Karen. Every phone call, every meeting, every illegal transaction. That's illegal wiretapping, Karen stammered. Actually, it's not, Agent Rodriguez interjected. Texas is a one-party consent state. If Mr. Miller was present during these conversations, he had every right to record them. Present. Karen's voice was barely a whisper. What do you mean, present? David smiled coldly. Did you really think I spent 15 years as a private investigator without learning how to conduct surveillance? Every accidental encounter, every time I happened to overhear your phone calls at school events, every conversation you had in public thinking no one was listening, I was there, Karen. Always watching, always recording. The truth hit Karen. Like a physical blow. You planned this. All of it. The pool, the meeting, everything. I planned to protect my family, David said. You made yourself the threat. Karen looked around desperately, at the investigators, at David's family, at the growing crowd of neighbors who'd come to watch the spectacle. Her perfect suburban empire was collapsing in real time, and she knew it. Please, she whispered, all her bravado finally cracking. I have children. Whatever I did, they don't deserve. Tell that to Mrs. Chen, David said quietly. Tell that to the Patels on Elm Street. Tell that to every elderly person you swindled out of their homes. Agent Rodriguez stepped forward with handcuffs. Karen Walsh, you're under arrest for mortgage fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent. As Karen was led away in handcuffs, her perfect mask finally completely shattered, David felt a hand slip into his. Sarah stood beside him, tears in her eyes but her back straight. Is it over? She asked quietly. David watched the police car disappear. Around the corner, taking Karen Walsh and 3 years of torment with it. Behind them, the jackhammers continued their work, erasing the last symbol of their neighborhood nightmare. It's over, he said, but even as he spoke the words, David knew they weren't entirely true. Karen Walsh was finished, but her children would remain next door, now without their mother. The neighborhood would need time to heal from the shock of learning their beloved community leader was a criminal. And somewhere in Texas, bigger fish in Karen's fraud network were already planning their next moves. The pool was gone, but the ripples from its destruction would spread far beyond Willowbrook Estates. Sometimes justice came with a price that everyone had to pay. Part 2. The storm BRS by 3 o'clock that afternoon. The Miller Pool Services truck sat in David's driveway like a declaration of war. The crew chief, a weathered man named Martinez, walked the perimeter of the pool with David, measuring and taking notes. Beautiful pool, Martinez said, shaking his head. Shame to see it go. Mind me asking why? Neighbor problems, David said. Simply, Martinez nodded knowingly. Ah, say no more. I've seen it before. Sometimes the only way to solve a problem is to eliminate it completely. As they spoke, David noticed curtains twitching in windows up and down Elm Street. Word traveled fast in Willowbrook Estates. Karen had undoubtedly been working the phones all afternoon, spinning her version of events to anyone who would listen. How long will it take? David asked. Full removal? About 5 days. We'll drain it first, then break up the concrete with jackhammers. It's going to be loud and messy. Perfect. Martinez raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He'd learned not to question clients' motivations too closely. Day as the crew finished their assessment, Emma and Tyler returned from school. David watched from the kitchen window as they spotted the true. 6 weeks later, David stood in his backyard where the pool used to be, watching his children play on the new swing set he'd installed in the space. The raw concrete had been covered with fresh sod, and Emma had planted a small garden along the border. For the first time in 3 years, their backyard felt like home, but victory had come with costs David hadn't anticipated. The Walsh house sat empty, a for sale sign planted in the front yard like a tombstone. Richard Walsh had fled to his mother's house in Oklahoma the day after Karen's arrest, taking Brandon and Brittany with him. The twins had left without saying goodbye, their rooms dark, their voices absent from the neighborhood's morning chorus. David told himself he felt no guilt about the children. They weren't his responsibility. But late at night, when sleep eluded him, he wondered if there had been another way, a path that would have stopped Karen without destroying her family entirely. Dad. Tyler appeared at his elbow, grass stains on his knees from the new lawn. Mrs. Chen is here to see you. David turned to see the elderly woman walking slowly across his yard, her cane tapping against the stepping stones he'd installed, to make the path easier for their older neighbors. At 83, Mrs. Chen had been forced to sell her home and move in with her daughter in Houston after Karen's reverse mortgage scheme had drained her equity. Mrs. Chen, David said, helping her to one of the patio chairs. I wasn't expecting you. I'm visiting my old neighbors, she said in her precise, careful English, saying goodbye to the place where I lived for 40 years. David's chest tightened. Mrs. Chen's forced sale had been the catalyst that transformed his investigation from neighborhood dispute to criminal case. When he discovered the paperwork showing how Karen had manipulated the elderly woman into a predatory loan, any lingering doubts about his mission had evaporated. I wanted to thank you, Mrs. Chen continued. The prosecutor says I might get some of my money back when they recover Karen's assets. You shouldn't have lost it in the first place, David said quietly. Mrs. Chen studied his face with the sharp eyes that had made her a successful teacher for 5 decades. You carry guilt that isn't yours to bear. Don't I? David sat heavily in the chair beside her. If I'd acted sooner, maybe I could have stopped her before she hurt you. Before she hurt anyone. And maybe you would have failed, Mrs. Chen replied. Maybe she would have been more careful, covered her tracks better. Maybe more people would have suffered. She reached over and patted his hand with her weathered fingers. Justice isn't clean, David. It's messy and imperfect, and sometimes it hurts innocent people. But the alternative is worse. Through the kitchen window, David could see Sarah preparing lunch, humming softly to herself. His wife had emerged from her depression like a butterfly from a cocoon. The constant stress of the neighborhood warfare finally lifted. She'd started painting again, filling the house with color and life that had been absent for months. The children next door, David said. Brandon and Brittany. They didn't choose their mother. No, Mrs. Chen agreed. But they were learning. From her. Learning that other people's property was theirs to take. Learning that rules didn't apply to them. Sometimes removing a bad influence is the kindest thing you can do for children, even if it hurts them in the short term. David wanted to believe that. He needed to believe it. A car pulled into his driveway. Marcus Rivera in his familiar white sedan. David's former partner emerged carrying a manila folder thick with documents. Mrs. Chen, Marcus said, tipping his head respectfully. Good to see you again. Agent Rivera. She stood slowly, gripping her cane. I should let you men talk business. David, thank you for the garden tour. The flowers Emma planted are beautiful. As Mrs. Chen made her way back to her daughter's car, Marcus settled into the vacated chair. Good. News or bad news first? Marcus asked. Bad news. Always bad news first. Marcus opened the folder. Richard Walsh is filing for divorce and claiming he knew nothing about Karen's schemes. His lawyers painting him as another victim. Is he? Hard to say. Either he's the most oblivious husband in Texas, or he's very good at playing dumb. The financial records suggest he benefited from the money, but proving he knew where it came from is difficult. What about the kids? Custody hearing next month. Richard wants full custody, obviously. Karen's lawyer is arguing for shared custody, despite her incarceration. David felt sick. She's facing federal charges and she wants custody. Prison doesn't automatically terminate parental rights, Marcus explained. And her lawyer's making the case that she's a nonviolent offender who made financial mistakes, not someone who poses a physical danger to children. Financial mistakes. David's voice hardened. She destroyed lives. I know. But the system isn't always logical. Marcus pulled out another document. The good news is that the FBI has arrested 6 other people in the mortgage fraud network. Karen's cooperation led them to the main players. She's looking at a plea deal, 8 years, instead of 20. 8 years, David repeated, for ruining dozens of lives. It's not enough, Marcus agreed. But it's something. And the civil suits are ongoing. The victims might recover some of their losses. Emma burst through the sliding door, her face flushed with excitement. Dad! Dad! Guess what? What, sweetheart? Mrs. Patterson called Mom. The new family that's buying the Walsh house has kids our age. Twin girls, and they love to read just like me. David felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that the empty house would have life again, but also estranged. Melancholy for the children who'd once lived there. That's wonderful, honey, he said. Emma skipped back inside. Marcus closed his folder. You did the right thing, David. I know it doesn't always feel that way, but you did. Did I? David stared at the space where his pool used to be. Sometimes I wonder if I became the thing I was fighting against. I manipulated people, recorded conversations without their knowledge, orchestrated Karen's downfall like some kind of puppet master. The difference, Marcus said, standing to leave, is that you were protecting your family from a real threat. Karen was exploiting vulnerable people for money. Intent matters. After Marcus left, David remained in his backyard as evening approached. The neighborhood was settling into its dinner routines, the sounds of normal family life drifting from. Open windows. The Walsh house remained dark and silent, a gap-toothed smile in a row of warm, lit homes. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, wrapping her arms around David from behind. Penny for your thoughts. Just thinking about consequences, David said. About the price of getting what you want. Do you regret it? David considered the question seriously. His family was happy and healthy. His home felt like a sanctuary again. The neighborhood was safe from Karen's predatory schemes. But somewhere in Oklahoma, 2 children were struggling to understand why their mother was in prison and their lives had been shattered. No, he said finally. I don't regret protecting my family, but I regret that it was necessary. Sarah tightened her embrace. The world isn't perfect, David. Sometimes good people have to make hard choices to stop bad people from hurting others. As if summoned by her words, Tyler appeared in the doorway. Dad, there's a news story on TV about Mrs. Walsh. They're calling her the suburban swindler. David winced. Even in disgrace, Karen was getting the attention she'd always craved. Turn it off, buddy, David called. We don't need to watch that. But as Tyler disappeared inside, David realized something had fundamentally changed in his son's voice. The anxiety that had plagued Tyler for years was gone, replaced by a confidence that came from seeing his father stand up to bullies. Emma, too, had blossomed since the pool's removal, no longer shrinking from conflict but standing tall in her own space. Maybe that was Karen's final, unintended gift, teaching his children that sometimes you had to fight for what was yours. Even if the cost was high, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, reflected not in pool water but in the windows of his home. David had won his war, but wars always left scars. The question was whether those scars would heal into wisdom or fester into bitterness. Only time would tell. But for tonight, in his own backyard, surrounded by his family's laughter, David Miller was finally at peace. The pool was gone. The threat was neutralized. And sometimes, that was enough. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't destroying Karen Walsh. It was reclaiming the simple joy of being home.